Hi everyone, this is Dan, and this is Batman Nightfall Volume 1. On this channel I've often talked about 1980s comics, and also why I believe that decade to be the apex of the American comic book. However, the 1990s is actually when I read my first comic book, though at the time I was only reading Archie comics and not Marvel or DC. The 90s is a decade that could be described as controversial. Comics sold crazy numbers during the early half of the decade to eventually collapse towards the end of the decade. DC and Marvel would both experience different levels of crash and burn during this decade, and Image Comics would both rise to prominence and eventually run out of steam towards the end of the decade. By the 2000s, manga would make great inroads into the American market, and Dark Horse and Viz would eventually dominate the bookstores for sequential art. But getting back to the topic at hand, the 90s was an interesting decade for DC. At the end of the 80s, DC was bought out by Warner Brothers, and the early boom of the 90s was in part driven by several controversial storylines produced by DC. The most famous was the Death of Superman story, which brought thousands, if not possibly millions, of new readers and collectors into comic book stores in the 90s. Another story that I covered on this channel was Emerald Twilight, in which the iconic Green Lantern Hal Jordan was forever turned into a villain. Of course, shortly after the Death of Superman, we have the story collected in this volume that this video is about, Nightfall. The multiple sensational stories by DC led to a massive influx of sales, but like a lot of the sales of the early 90s, this did not last. DC was luckily better run than Marvel at the time and was able to weather the collapse of the 90s thanks to the support from Warner Brothers, which was having success with animated series adaptations of DC heroes. DC was able to also control their destiny better than Marvel in this decade by generating imprints such as Vertigo that allowed DC to diversify their line of comics and graphic novels. They were even able to maintain a good presence in bookstores thanks to the trade paperbacks and original graphic novels. Remember, this was the 90s and the 2000s. Digital comics was still very new, and bookstore chains like Barnes & Noble were popular. Now that I've gotten the background out of the way, let's talk about Batman Nightfall Volume 1. This collected volume retails for $29.99 USD and collects Batman issues 491 through 500, Detective Comics issues 659 through 666, Number of the Beast, Showcase 93, issues 7 and 8, Batman Shadow of the Bat numbers 16 and 18, and of course, Batman Vengeance of Bane special number 1. At 630 pages, this puts this collected volume at a staggering value proposition of less than 5 cents per page. Needless to say, if you're looking for value, these collected volumes are the way to go, and you can easily find these volumes for below retail price. This volume starts with the amazing Vengeance of Bane special and never really lets you go in terms of driving the drama and the stakes for the legendary hero Batman. The amazing writing team of Chuck Dixon, Doug Moench, and Alan Grant all work well together to keep a cohesive and dark narrative going. Artists Jim Aparo, Graham Nolan, Norm Breyfogle, Jim Ballant, Brett Blevins, Klaus Janson, and Mike Manley put on an all-star effort in this volume, and the late and legendary Denny O'Neil helms all of these books as editor. The basic premise of the Batman Nightfall storyline is that a new villain emerges in Gotham, Bane, an extremely intelligent and ruthless man with superhuman strength powered by the deadly drug Venom. All of Batman's rogue gallery are released from Arkham Asylum to unleash chaos on the city. Batman must run down and capture all of his villainous foes, all while Bane and his minions stalk him in the dark. Needless to say, as is shown on the thumbnail, and really any article or video on this storyline, Batman is defeated and his back crushed by Bane in the climax of the storyline. This leads to several changes in Gotham, including a new Batman taking over for a while. Nightfall is an exciting storyline in the Batman comics, and the art and writing done in this series is fantastic. This volume in particular is an amazing value for the amount of story you get for the money. I particularly like the individual issues leading up to Batman's confrontation with Bane, in which he has to hunt down and kick the shit out of all of his famous adversaries. Especially when he kicks the teeth out of Poison Ivy. Classic! That being said, the storyline isn't without flaw. I personally found everything after Batman's defeat at Bane's hand to be sometimes a chore to read through. Azrael taking over as Batman, though I understood what editorial and the writers were attempting to accomplish, was not a very interesting character and somewhat not believable as Batman. I particularly did not like him suddenly remembering stuff from his subconscious to design and build a battlesuit out of thin air like some Tony Stark ripoff. Batman refusing aid from Robin in the early part of this volume was also a little annoying, especially when it was repeated so many times from issue to issue. I still would recommend to any comic fan or fan of sequential art stories to check out this volume. It's too good of a deal to pass up for this many comics, especially if you get it for lower than retail price. Anyhow, let's see how I did on art. I have been meaning to do more sequential art rather than single piece illustrations. I feel like if I want to do my own graphic novel, then I really should be practicing sequential art as much as possible rather than trying to make single pieces. This page I did with just pencils. I actually used the Marvel method for scripting rather than the full script method. I will actually be doing a video about the Marvel style script later. We see some bad characters kicking open a door of some business about ready to rob it. Suddenly they look back surprised to see who behind them? The Dark Knight. Batman handles the bad guys Spider-Man style and leaves them for the police. I think it's important to be able to tell a story with minimum art as possible. It puts a premium on the art and on the reader's money and time. If I was to finish this, I would transfer the art over to Bristol board, ink it, color it, and add some dialogue and narration to finish this one-page story, a la Stan Lee's method. But for now, it was just a fun little page to pencil out. That's the video, everyone. If you like this video, please hit the thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't subscribed, hit the bell for notifications. If you have any comments on Batman Nightfall or my art, leave it down below, and I will see you next time.